Good early afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this Maynooth University Social Sciences Institute lunchtime seminar, where it's our great institutional pleasure and also a particular personal pleasure for Sian and I to introduce Professor Andrew Baldwin, who's going to talk to us at lunchtime. But first, I'd just like to thank Lucy for all of their support with this seminar and also making Andrew's visit possible. We had a very interesting and very well attended seminar last night that Sian organised around critical perspectives around climate migration. And the fact that Andrew was central to that discussion, I think will be a surprise to nobody after he has introduced us to some of the central themes of his book, The Other of Climate Change. Andrew is Professor of Human Geography at Durham University and has been writing about questions around migration, race, climate change for some time. It's a very personal pleasure for me to introduce this book because it's published in a book series that I co-edit, and it was a book when we saw the proposal right from the start and then read the first drafts, that this was a book that was going to make an extremely important and also properly provocative contribution to our thinking about the climate or about the category of climate migration. And no spoilers, Anna's going to talk about what's in the book, but what I particularly like about this book is the way that it doesn't just position the category of climate migration for us as something which emerges in a world that has been degraded by racialized capitalist modernity, but it also shows us the way in which the category of climate migration itself and the category of climate migrant, in the way that they're being assembled and produced institutionally and politically, are actually part of the reproduction of race. They do racializing and race work. And I think that is a very, very interesting argument for us to engage with today. So Andrew, it's a great pleasure to have you here. There are people on Zoom and there are people in the room, and it's all yours.
Super. Well, thanks, Gavin, and thank you to the Institute for sponsoring the event and my visit. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you to all of you for coming. And of course, thank you to Sian for all the labor that she's put into organizing this event and the event from last night. What I thought I would do is just really speak to the book, which was published last year in 2022 in September. So it's been out now for about a year and a half. And I think what I want to do is focus on this concept of racial futurism. When I was writing the book, it sort of dawned on me that this is it felt to me like a new genre of racial rule that I was observing within this, the big space of climate migration discourse. And it still feels right. I mean, even after, writing it a couple of years ago, and I go back and I look at this concept, it still feels like a useful concept to me at any rate. So I think that's maybe a good sign. Anyway, so what I thought I would do is just sort of walk through the general arguments in the book with a focus on developing this idea of racial futurism, and then we'll open it up for conversation. Yeah. So I guess the first thing I would start with is just to say something about the general argument that I'm trying to make in the book. And that is that when we think about climate change and human migration, we will often be struck by the headlines that we read in news media, primarily. By 2050, 250 million people will be forced to migrate due to climate change. Sometimes that figure goes up to 1 billion. Sometimes it's 143 million. It kind of depends on who's putting forward this quantitative estimate. But this is kind of the entry into the discourse, if you like, primarily through news media. But I think you can see it elsewhere. You can see the figure of the climate migrant refugee in climate cinema. You see it in cli-fi literature. You see it in political rhetoric. You see it in international policy and surfacing in international climate change governance. So it's kind of a ubiquitous discourse. And certainly the figure of the climate migrant refugee is a ubiquitous figure in climate change discourse more broadly. Anyway, so the general argument that I'm trying to make in the book is that there is at stake, the general argument is that the notion of the figure of the climate migrant refugee emerges as a figure of concern, a figure of political concern at the very moment, the Anthropocene or climate change, in which the very notion of the human is now being called into question, right? Climate change threatens the existence of humanity. The Anthropocene threatens the uniqueness of the human in a way. And it's in this planetary moment where we see the emergence of the figure of the climate migrant, climate refugee. And what part of the argument then is that I'm trying to make in the book is that the figure is an invention, it is invented by a kind of Western humanism in order to shore up Western humanism precisely in this moment that Western humanism is facing the possibility of its demise. So the other, in this case, does what the other of Europe always does, which is that it shores up, the European subject, if you like. So that's broadly the argument in the book, and then related to that is that I think what is emerging in the discourse on climate change and human migration is a unique genre of power. So this is, and I'm referring to this power as racial futurism. I just have to remind myself. Right. So what I mean by racial futurism, I'll try and explain more about what I mean by racial futurism. But the discourse, on climate change and migration very much has this quality of being about rescuing the other. It sort of announces a concern that those working within the space of climate change have for those who will be most adversely affected by climate change. This is the sort of the narrative that we find in climate justice, right? Where climate change represents a massive future injustice that will be done to some of the world's most vulnerable, some of the world's poorest. And the discourse on climate change and migration tries to capture, the detrimental effect that climate change will have on the world's poorest. And the discourse emerges then as a sort of discourse that is concerned with rescuing and saving those who will be most adversely affected by climate change. And my argument is that the figure of the climate change migrant works as a category of the other. It works as a category of Europe's other, not too unlike the way in which the other, in the work of Edward Said, for example, operates as the very means by which Europe itself comes into existence, right? If we can extract the basic argument from Said, it would be something along the lines of, Europe only comes into being as Europe in relation to the non-European other, right? And so I think what I'm arguing is something very similar to Said. The difference being, however, that Said's other tends to be or is exclusively construed in terms of a kind of historical other, an other that exists in a kind of pre-modern historical time, that is a time prior to modernity itself, whereas the figure of the climate migrant operates in a different sort of space-time, and that is the time of the future, right? So we're looking into the future to extract some understanding of this other through the project of racial futurism, as opposed to looking into the historical past. To think about this in relation to, this concept of racial rule, which I take from David Theo Goldberg, it's useful, I think, maybe to compare racial futurism to two genres of racial rule that David Theo Goldberg uses, one of which is this idea of racial historicism, and the other, this idea of racial naturalism. Racial naturalism is the idea that the racial other is fundamentally, primordial in origin. It is immutable. It is a racial other that is, fixed, that exists outside of historical modernity. the sort of the historical analog of racial naturalism would be South African apartheid and the U.S. slavery from the 17th, 18th century. Conversely, racial historicism is a different kind of modality of racial rule, where the racial other is not understood as primordial and natural, but as embedded in historical time, but as one that is understood as developmentally immature and a racial other that can be educated and edified and brought into the sort of operation of modernity, the institutions of modernity, and so forth, providing that it is, properly educated. So the historical analog here would be the residential school system in Canada, for example, where various various missions and the Canadian government investing heavily in the whitening of Indigenous kids, basically through the 19th century and 20th century, as a means of of edifying them, bringing them into modernity. Two very distinct forms of racial rule, both of which coincide with particular formations of capitalism. That's another important point that David Theo Goldberg is making. But in both cases, the racial other is understood to be, to exist in a sort of historical time that predates modernity. And again, racial futurism is concerned with the constitution of racial otherness through a different kind of time space in the future. And I think also it coincides, the emergence of racial futurism as a modality of power coincides with a specific formation of capitalism, contemporary neoliberalism, and we can sort of unpack contemporary neoliberalism. But if we think about contemporary neoliberalism as a sort of mode of capitalism that is primarily concerned about universally exposing populations to the vagaries of the market and universally exposing people to risk and the risks that are inherent to the market, there is a kind of future orientation to neoliberalism that I think racial futurism is also bound up in. I'll try and get to some of that a little bit later. So central to the argument then of the book is this really interesting book, if you haven't read, by Jeff Mann and Joel Wainwright, called Climate Leviathan, in which their core argument is that, or one of their arguments, maybe not a core argument, is that if you want to understand how capitalism is adapting to climate change, then really what you need to look for is the way in which what they're calling the political is adapting to climate change. Of course, the notion of the political comes from Carl Schmitt. The political is, understood as the sovereign act of constituting the distinction between friend and enemy. This is the sort of foundational moment of the political, and through Schmitt, Wainwright and Mann make a slightly different argument and say, actually, the political is really the constitution of the relationship between the dominant and the dominated. And if you want to understand the adaptation of capitalism, you need to understand how that relation between dominant and dominated is constituted. And my argument is that if you want to understand the adaptation of the political, then look no further than the discourse on climate change and human migration, because there you will find a kind of a new formation of dominant and dominated, where the dominated are those who come to be construed in the language of the climate migrant and the climate refugee. And I'll have a little bit more to say about that in a minute as well. Okay, so racial futurism, I've already mentioned, it's not about positioning the other in anterior time, but in future time. A really sort of important logic, I guess, at stake in racial futurism is that racial difference is codified less in terms of the idea of the racial other being different from oneself, and more in terms of a racial other that is yet to come. So it's a kind of prophetic figure, if you like, that is emerging in the future and is bearing down on the present. And it's, I think, that sort of notion of the yet to come that I think is really central to this idea of racial futurism. So how do we get sort of from climate migration discourse to race? For me, the key methodological point in making that claim lies in the way in which the figure of the climate migrant refugee comes to be represented in all manner of discourses. My primary focus in the book is on international relations, specifically international texts that are produced by international agencies like the International Organization for Migration, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and there's a couple of others. And really what I'm trying to get at is the idea that the figure of the climate migrant comes to be a signifier of race. It comes to carry the meaning of race. And we can get to that just by looking at the way the figure is constructed in these texts and certainly others as well. There are a number of different tropes that I identify in the book that can help us better understand how the figure carries racial connotation. A couple of them just to flag up now. One is the trope of naturalization, and that is the way in which the figure of the climate migrant is explained. The difference that this figure comes to represent is explained solely in reference to the idea of nature, or conversely, is represented solely in relation to its dehistoricization, the way that this figure comes to be absented from the particular historical contexts that it's embedded in. So a really good example of the way in which the figure comes to be naturalized is the example of Bangladesh, where very often coastal Bangladeshis are who move from coastal Bangladesh into Dhaka and Chittagong are very often construed as climate migrants. You know, Bangladeshi media is routinely portraying this migration in terms of climate change in the order of 500,000 migrants annually. And what is interesting and important about that is that when you think about this migration in its historical context, so much of coastal Bangladesh has been transformed since the early 1980s around shrimp aquaculture and soft shell crab aquaculture, on the back of a kind of investment regime promoted by the World Bank going back to the early 1980s, which, the transformation of that coastline radically altered land tenure regimes in coastal Bangladesh. And this is, a very significant contributing factor to these migrations. When those migrants get construed solely in terms of climate change, then that historical context is lost. And so this is the process, I think, of naturalization, the means by which people are robbed of being understood in their historical context. And it is a practice of power, I think, to constitute people in this way. Another of the tropes that I discuss in the book is around this idea of the loss of political status. So in this case, the category of the climate refugee is often construed as, is an example of how the trope of the loss of political status operates. Now, how does that work? The category of the climate refugee has no legal status whatsoever, right? It has no sort of legal status in international law. The Refugee Convention makes no reference to climate or environment as reasons for, giving people asylum. And yet, so this practice of constituting people as climate refugees, to me, is about sort of positioning, vast numbers of people, predominantly in the global South, into a kind of legal non-space, into a space for which there is no, legal status. And that practice of moving people from their, ordinary political contexts into a political or legal non-space, I think, is another form of power that is, I think, racial. And we can get to the racial dimension of that simply by thinking about the history of transatlantic slavery and the way in which it is precisely this practice of moving people, the figure of the slave, into a kind of legal non-space where individuals, their rights, political rights, are permanently suspended. A really good example of, or sort of clarification of this argument, comes from an article that Karen McNamara and her colleague, whose name I can't remember, Lazarus, I think is her surname, wrote in 2009, in which they interviewed a bunch of ambassadors of Pacific Island states who were in New York City, the sort of ambassadors in the New York City UN headquarters. And they asked these ambassadors to the Pacific Islands, about this concept of the climate refugee. Is this a useful category? Do you use this category? And they universally said, absolutely not. We don't use this category, because if we did, we would be abrogating the rights of those who we actually represent, right? We would be positioning them into, this legal non-space, and we can't do that. We would be forfeiting our legal obligations to the people that we represent if we were to do that. So it's just a means of corroborating this point around the loss of political status. I think, and there's a couple of other tropes as well, but I won't go into detail about those. Ultimately, I think what is at stake then in the discourse around climate change and migration is the way in which the figure of the climate migrant refugee comes to be pushed outside the category of the human. It comes to represent something other than the figure of the human. It represents the other to the human. And what I try and do in the book is, and this is, this is maybe an area that we can discuss afterwards, is I try and make the argument that this practice of pushing the figure of the climate migrant refugee outside the category of the human is the repetition of the way in which Blackness comes to operate in relation to the category of the human as well. And here I'm drawing primarily on the work of Frank Wilderson to make this argument. I suppose another point that I would make is around Calvin Warren's really interesting book, Ontological Terror, in which he's making an argument around the way in which the category of Blackness comes to signify nothing. It comes to be a signifier of nothingness. In Calvin Warren's, according to Calvin Warren, nothing, if you like, the category of nothing really frightens metaphysics. It really frightens the metaphysician. And I think that, again, there's something similar going on within this discourse around climate change and migration, where as soon as you enter into the discourse, it becomes very clear, very, very quickly, that even though people speak about the relationship between climate change and migration, they are also quick to point out that it is impossible to define someone as a climate migrant or a climate refugee. And the reason for that is that there is a kind of the impossibility of explaining migration in relation to climate change alone, right? Climate change is always a function of a whole range of different factors, or at least migration is always a function of a range of different factors, climate change being one of those. amongst a range of different elements. And so it becomes virtually impossible to attribute the migration of something called a climate migrant or a climate refugee to climate change alone. So part of my argument then is that the figure of the climate migrant refugee is fundamentally an undefinable figure. It's an undecidable figure. It is, if you like, the figure of nothingness. So I think that's maybe worth giving some thought to as well, that in the practice of constructing people outside the category of the human, they're being pushed into this nothing space. And again, there's an historical analog here through the way in which Blackness is often construed in the same way. I mean, we can come back to this question about Alana Lenton's arguments around not racism and race denialism later. I suppose on this point, I would just make the point that there's a very interesting structural feature of the discourse on climate change and migration, which is a kind of a routine distancing by which those who promulgate the discourse try and distance themselves from environmental determinist thinking. So environmental determinism, of course, has a really problematic history bound up with 19th century racisms and so on. And in the contemporary discourse around climate change and migration, academics primarily, but you see it in international texts, the texts that are being written by international agencies, which are often written by the very academics who are making some of these arguments, will say, you know, we're not talking about climatic determinism. We're not making an argument that climate determines migration. We're making an argument that climate change is much more complex. It's a much more climate migration is a much more nuanced sort of phenomenon, not a deterministic phenomenon. And what I'm arguing is in one of the chapters in the book is that this practice of distancing contemporary discourse from a kind of, 19th century clunky environmental determinism operates in the same way that the claim of I am not a racist operates in racist discourse. It's basically a distancing, it's the contemporary discourse making the argument that, we're not racists. We're talking about a novel historical phenomena that requires our attention. What is interesting, though, is that if you start to look at some of the 19th century environmental determinists, they're actually making arguments that are not too dissimilar from what contemporary academics are making in relation to climate change and migration. This idea that it is a complexly constituted sort of phenomenon. Anyway, we can talk about this notion of race denialism later. So racial futurism then is, I'm arguing that it's a genre of what Brian Masumi calls ontopower. This is a form, for Masumi, this is a form of power that operates less on its causes and more on, it's about regulating the effects of particular discourses. It is about sort of the regulation of effects before such effects actually materialize. So it's a kind of ontopower is a distinctive mode of power that operates on the sort of, the future, for example, as it is arising. And I think climate migration discourse is a really good sort of way of thinking about ontopower. And it is sort of emblematic of what I'm calling racial futurism. I found the work of Richard Gruson really useful, his idea of premediation. Richard Gruson develops this idea of premediation in relation to the Gulf Wars, particularly the US-led invasion of Afghanistan in 2003. And what he was looking at were the months leading up to this invasion, and in particularly in US television media. And what he observed is that the sort of narrative was not whether or not the US would invade. It was, the assumption was the US would invade Afghanistan. But what they were doing in media was portraying all the different ways that the invasion might actually unfold. So giving accounts of what the US military would likely do in this scenario, or what it would likely do in that scenario. And what Grusin is arguing is that this is a form of premediation, mediating this war even before it occurs. And part of his argument is that this is with the view to ensuring that when the invasion actually does occur, that US media viewing publics wouldn't be surprised by this event. It wouldn't come as a shock. So it was sort of a mode of preparing media consuming publics for this future eventuality. And I'm arguing that something is perhaps similar in relation to climate change and migration discourse. This is a mode of, it operates as a mode of premediation. It's a mechanism of mediating the future before the future actually arises. And there's a sort of public pedagogy that is at stake here, educating publics about what to expect in the future, so that when the future does finally arrive, it won't come as a shock, but even more so that interventions that are designed to mitigate whatever the effects of the future might be on the present themselves won't come as a surprise. Publics will have been sort of warmed to this possibility. Really important element then of the discourse on climate change and migration is its underlying epistemology, and that is, it is predominantly written in the language of the future conditional. The forms of knowledge that are being used to produce this phenomena are themselves future forms of knowledge that are about knowing the future. So scenarios become a really instrumental mechanism by which climate migration comes to be known and made present to us. Climate science fiction becomes another really important epistemology or form of knowledge in the way in which climate migration comes to us. So what I'm trying to suggest then is that we think carefully about this particular form of knowledge and the work that it is doing. And part of the argument then is that it is these speculative epistemologies are, they constitute racial futurism as an anticipatory form of racial rule. It's about anticipating what parts of the world might, become a problem, where individuals in the future may be migrating as a consequence of climate change. So it's a modality of rule that tries to anticipate how people might become a problem in the future. And then a form of racial rule that then attempts to mitigate those futures before they actually arise. But I think part of what also I'm really drawn to about this notion of anticipatory racial rule and racial futurism is the way in which the discourse itself is a kind of it is about fostering a particular kind of orientation to the future. It is about fostering a particular sensibility to the future, making climate change relevant through its through a kind of future orientation, inuring us to the possibilities in advance of the future actually arising. So, there's a kind of, when we think about climate change, there is a kind of intuitive logic that feels right, that yes, climate change will have a detrimental effect on the lives of people, and people will need to move as a, relocate as a consequence of climate change, right? There's an intuitive logic to that. That is, it's hard to sort of, to be critical of that because it just seems so obvious. And I think part of what I'm trying to get at is in the book then is that this discourse is around it, if it makes sense that climate change will have this effect on mobility, then the discourse is precisely about making this sense. It's about making this, giving this possibility that its realness, if you like. It's sort of producing this sensibility. It is a kind of a form of sense making, if you like. And then in the last chapter of the book, I try and develop some of this thinking around racial futurism in relation to racial capitalism. And I think ultimately what I'm trying to do here is make the argument that those who would be a problem under conditions of climate change, those who come to be construed as climate migrants or climate refugees, in terms of the language of the future, are being converted into a use value for capital. They come to the problematic status of the figure of the climate migrant refugee is appropriated by capital and converted into a use value. So how can we get to that argument? Well, there's a really critical moment in the sort of late 2000s into the 2000 teens, where there's a really important discursive shift that occurs where academics and international institutions start to move away from the notion of climate refugees and climate migrants and adopt the vocabulary of migration as adaptation. And that is, it's a kind of a narrative that is promoted in direct contrast to the way this sort of security narrative that was really popular in the 2000s, in which the figure of the climate migrant refugee was routinely construed as a catalyst for political violence, where the argument is made that under conditions of climate change, there will be wars and violence, and it is the figure of the climate refugee that catalyzes these moments of violence. The Syrian civil war often gets construed as the historical example. The migration as adaptation thesis is also counterposed to the notion of the figure of the climate migrant as a pending humanitarian crisis. So under conditions of climate change, people will have to move in large numbers, and they pose a humanitarian problem for states around the world and so forth. And in both cases, the migration is the security discourse and the humanitarian crisis discourse both construe the climate migrant refugee as a kind of a failure of adaptation, an inability to adapt to conditions of climate change, hence why they become understood as problems. The migration as adaptation argument emerged in the late 2000s as a kind of antidote to those two discourses, promoted by international institutions. The UK Government Office for Science was really instrumental in constituting this discourse as well. And the basic argument is that rather than construing migration as a failure of adaptation, migration should be understood as one of the primary means by which people adapt to climate change. In this case, migration is understood to be an inherently beneficial, human attribute. Human beings have always used migration as a means of accommodating environmental change, political change, technological change, what have you. So there's a real sort of effort to try and reconstitute migration in a positive vocabulary, and hence the emergence of this migration as adaptation argument. Critiques have emerged around the migration as adaptation argument. The primary critique is that this is a sort of a form of biopolitics. It is about constituting a kind of security through the safe movement, the continuous circulation of migrants. One of the examples that's given as what migration as adaptation might look like is the idea of circular migration schemes, where you've got and temporary migration schemes where you have, for example, Bangladeshis moving to the Gulf, on 6-month labor contracts, working temporarily in the Gulf and remitting their earnings back to Bangladesh, and then themselves, after 6 or 8 months or a year, moving back to Bangladesh, and then beginning the cycle all over again. So this practice of circular migration becomes, at least for some international institutions, a really, a sort of policy solution or a policy example of what migration as adaptation might look like. The argument that I'm making, and that others have made, is that this is really just a form of labor exploitation. Okay, yeah. How are we doing for time? 2 minutes. Oh my gosh, I've been speaking for way too long. Okay, I'm going to end there and just say that, really what is going on here, I think, in the migration as adaptation argument is that, this is, a form of labor exploitation, and we need to think about it as such in relation, again, to the adaptation of capitalism to climate change. Anyway, thank you for listening. I'm sorry I went much longer than I had anticipated, but thank you. Oh, right, okay.
Okay, we need to use a roving mic, and then are there questions on? Nobody yet. Well, we'll start in the room. Anybody who wants to ask Andrew a question have to pass this microphone around. Sienna has a question.
Thanks so much, Andrew. Could you talk a bit more about bordering and technology and the concept of racial futurism and climate migration?
Yeah. It's not something that I've written about, actually. It doesn't come up in the book. And if anything, I think my thinking around the border is, and bordering practices in relation to climate change, is that there's, I think, a tendency to overstate the significance of the border as the site where we can understand this constitution of the political. It's an obvious place to go to try and think about the political in relation to climate change. We can say, okay, well, this, the U.S. government or Frontex in the European Union is, intensifying border fortification as a means of keeping climate migrants and climate refugees out. And you see that argument made all the time. Whether states are actually, fortifying borders because of climate change is a secondary question. But I think I would encourage people to think less in terms of the border as a site for thinking about the constitution of the political, and actually more in terms of the specific, and this is your point about technology, thinking more in terms of the very calculative techniques that are used to construct the number. I'm thinking in particular a series of World Bank reports that used the technique of gravity modeling, a computational practice that is about measuring the sort of the relative values between two different places. Really sophisticated calculative technique that really doesn't have anything to do with borders inherently, but it is simply about sort of calculating the numbers of climate migrants. And I think that there's something really important politically that's going on there that is more significant to me than bordering practices.
Yeah. Well, thank you. It's very interesting. I was just wondering, you how much you will, or if you develop it more, of course, more than in the presentation, but the relation between the migration, racial futurism, and the mobilizing of extreme right-wing politics. We see that where I come from, we see that in this country, but also my home country, where that is the major argument for very repressive actions, and also the dismantling of the previous, this is Sweden, previous welfare states.
Mm-hmm.
So it is a motivation, an argument, and drives something particularly dangerous development. So I was just wondering how you're thinking about that.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. It's this is actually not the question of the far right in relation to these discourses is not something that I develop in the book, and really the argument that I'm making is motivated to draw attention to the kind of the dormant racism, that is to say, the invisible racisms that constitute climate change discourse more broadly. And that is a discourse that has a tendency to be more reflective of political liberalism and liberalism more generally. So it's about drawing attention to the racism of contemporary liberalism more so than it is about calling out the racisms of the far right. I think that there is, though, a lot of scope and a lot of really important work that needs to be done on climate change in the far right, and people are doing it. I think that Andreas Malm's, we were talking about this last night, Andreas Malm's book, Black Fuel, White Skin, I think is a really important book. And he's trying to get at this, he develops this idea of fossil fascism, the idea that fascism is a new fascism is emerging around the hyper fetishization of fossil fuel production, and as a direct contradiction or refusal of climate change politics. And I think there's an element of that argument that is compelling, but I think it's also slightly misguided in the sense that new and emerging fascisms in the 21st century will actually, I think, embrace the politics of climate change. The figure of Elon Musk for me really stands out here, and Tesla as the electrification of the transportation system as a response to climate change. He's like the poster child for contemporary far right thinking, and he's not engaging in fossil fascism, quite the opposite. So that's where I would sort of want us to direct our thinking in relation to the far right on some of these questions, but I haven't done that work as yet.
I think we're going to take one question and then Mary take your question. Yeah, I think we have time for all. So there's one online, was there? Okay, and then two in the room. So
you talked about how capitalism is adapting to climate change. Can you talk more about what you're seeing there, even beyond the migration issue, especially since capitalism seems to be hurting us headlong into global warming?
Sorry, I didn't quite hear the first part of that.
You talked about how capitalism is adapting to climate change.
Yeah.
Can you talk more about what you were seeing there, even beyond the migration issue?
Yeah, I think for me that question about the adaptation of capital started. I started to observe it in 2005 at the climate COP in Montreal, where by far the most sophisticated political positions that were emerging in that event were being promulgated by the insurance and finance sectors, right? This was the year after, a couple of years after Katrina, and the slow dawning on the insurance sector that they're sitting on a massive liability, and creditors are sitting on massive liabilities that need to be managed and so on. So capital is hyper attentive to the detrimental effects of climate change. Capital needs to adapt. the sort of in the contemporary moment, I think the figure of Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of England, is a really good example of the same, where he's, constant. I think he's the UN special envoy for climate finance or something like this, right? His role being, trying to develop a kind of a coalition of willing finance companies to, really address climate change fulsomely. So I think that's where that's where I think about the adaptation of capital. It's with finance capital and with insurance capital. On the question, how that translates into migration. I mean, there's and I do write about this in the book. There's a really compelling, interesting report written by the Asian Development Bank that looks at the relationship between specific forms of insurance practice and climate migration, where climate migration comes to represent a kind of a financial liability for states, right? What do you do, like as a state, what do you do with 100,000 or 200,000 people who are being forced to move because of an extreme weather event, from A to B? Where do you get the money to finance that humanitarian crisis? Insurance mechanisms, particularly parametric insurance mechanisms, were floated in this Asian Development Bank as a means of accessing capital that states would need in order to meet some of those liabilities. So, on the one hand, you can see how that would be actually a really innovative form of financing. And sure, states would, and you could even see NGOs getting involved in this and arguing that this is, could be a means of constituting a particular form of climate justice. But really, when you're talking about insurance practices and the writing of insurance policies at scale, the primary beneficiaries of those policies are not the states or those displaced, and but they are insurance companies who are earning the premiums off of those policies. So that's where I go when I think about the adaptation of capital.
Do you have time, Gavin?
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, it's just a really quick one. It's really a kind of a clarification from my own point of view, from the way I think about things. But you did say that climate change, migration is not about rescuing the other, but really it's Western humanism's attempt to rescue itself.
That's right.
And I'm just wondering what this unitary category of Western humanism is. Like, it's not a person or a political movement. Is it even an ideology in a world in which democracy is unraveling everywhere we look? So where is that Western humanism embedded, or how does it manifest itself? Thanks.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think what I'm trying to do, the reason that I went to the category of the human and to humanism was partly a kind of a strategic decision to not hit the reader over the head with questions about whiteness straight away. So if you scratch the surface of the category of the human, very quickly you get to the category of whiteness. So my use of that term is really about drawing readers into the argument in a way that feels safe, in a way that feels less confrontational, and then later introducing the idea that the notion of the human is a signifier of whiteness. So that's kind of how I think about that. There is, it is problematic to speak in such universalizing language. But at the same time, like, climate change itself is a universalizing discourse, right? And a lot of the texts that I'm working with are international texts. And so much of the discourse around climate change and migration genealogically, or it has its sort of genealogical origin in international relations, given the sort of universality of climate change as a politics. So that's kind of why I end up using that category. But yeah.
I have a question that probably requires a bit of imagination, in the sense, where do you place racial futurism as a concept for contemporary cross-hemispheric organizing and intersectional organizing for climate change and climate justice? Or where do you see the utility of this concept there? How do you see it moving on ground?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think probably the first step, like if we're to take up this concept strategically and politically, I think the first step would be to recognize that all too often the discourse on climate change has an aracial quality to it, right? It's sort of, at best what we get is the language of climate justice, which for me is the sort of box into which questions about race get deposited within the wider framework of climate change, right? If you want to talk about race and climate change, you talk about climate justice. And there, race comes to be understood as, climate change comes to be construed as a racializing, or how can I put it? That if climate change is to be understood as racist, it is because of the effects of climate change. The effects of climate change will be disproportionately borne by the racialized, right? So, and I think what I would advocate would be a much closer attention to the way in which climate change discourse becomes an empirical site through which to understand the reconstitution of racism. Rather than understanding racism, climate change as having a set of detrimental effects on the already racialized, climate change becomes a site in which race itself comes to be rewritten, rescripted away from its kind of 19th century, the legacies of 19th century racism. And there, I think racial futurism may have a part to play. So in a kind of broader public pedagogy around thinking about the way in which race gets reproduced in the context of climate change.
Brilliant. Thank you, Andrew, so much.
Yeah,
from
good.
everybody on Teams and everyone in the room. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah.
And thanks everybody for coming. And thank you once again to MU Social Sciences Institute for supporting and organizing this event, and to Sian for everything she's done in organizing this series of events. And now it's the weekend, kind of. Thank you.
Yeah, good. Thank you so much. Thanks.